My name is Jaden Chong. I'm recording in my home studio at the moment, but I'm one of the piano teachers here at Vincent Music in the West End. And I'm here to give a lesson today in a kind of cross-transferability. So, what's the term cross-transferability? So, for instance, skills that are transferable between one thing to another. In this case, alongside being a piano teacher, I'm a guitar student. And I find one of my students is a piano and guitar student of mine. And I found that in this particular case, there's a few things which I've learned over my kind of time of being a musician, which has been really, really helpful for me to use kind of as a general. Now, there's a few things which I've kind of learnt over the years. Guitar was admittedly my first instrument, and the thing that I found first off is that learning chord shapes on the guitar is very difficult. It takes time, and also with guitars and calluses, it does take a while. But it is something which is admittedly a bit of an inevitable when it comes to learning with that. But the second is with chords. Now, chords, well, I briefly mentioned chords just then, but with chords, in some ways on the piano, they can be either really easy or really difficult. For instance, if I were to go on something like C major, yes, I can do something like that, but you definitely would not be able to do quite the same thing on the guitar. But there are certain things on the guitar which are very similar to that. So, with the guitar, there's 6 strings. For those who aren't familiar with the instrument, a guitar has 6 strings, going from in standard tuning, E, A, D, G, B, E. Now, whereas Mark just briefly mentioned, that's just a slight little introduction there, but also as I mentioned, that it's a shame I don't have my guitar with me at the moment, unfortunately. But when it comes to the chord shapes on the guitar, they're definitely radically different. In some ways they are radically different from the piano, but in some ways they are quite similar in a lot of ways. So, in reference with how we'll kind of approach going from guitar versus piano thing, I would approach it from several different bases. In some ways your left hand does a lot more of the work on the guitar because you have to figure out the chord shapes. So, say for instance, if I were to have, so, I'm showing my hands kind of like this, right? So, this would be my approximate position for a C major, and then this would be something for like an F major chord. I realise it all looks silly without the guitar as a context, but in reference to that, while there's not necessarily that much similarity in reference to guitar, it's an underlying understanding of how we use our shapes, which makes things a little bit easier in terms of actually learning some things on the piano, because there's some awkward shapes on the guitar which can be a little bit annoying to deal with at the time, but once we settle that, we learn a few patterns. Now, I personally have a thing about patterns. Patterns are one of the things which helps us, for me it's really make or break sort of thing. Once we understand the pattern of something, it makes it a lot easier to learn and comprehend and understand something. So, in reference with this, one similar thing about the guitar and the piano, scales. On the piano, it is admittedly a much more linear sort of thing. On the guitar, it's a much more kind of different position, because you'd be doing your guitar work kind of in the same space. You wouldn't be going up. You wouldn't be going up in that direction with your hand necessarily. Sometimes you will, and actually oftentimes you will when you get to later stages of the guitar. But in the beginning stages, you'll just be working mainly on the first 2 to 3 frets. But in context, the process of learning scales is the same. There's several different patterns, and while the strings are a little bit different, particularly in terms of texture, once we start learning our scales there, it does become markedly a little bit easier in reference with learning some things on the guitar and the piano. Because while there are different sounds to learning the things, some of the musicianship involved is the same. So, what else can we kind of think of? Now, obviously with our right hand, it's definitely a different thing for the guitar versus the piano. With the guitar, it's much more of the strumming hand. Obviously, we can't necessarily strum on the piano, because otherwise it might not necessarily work. But in saying that, there is a lot of key differences, a lot of key factors here which can make A lot of the guitar and piano learning very transferable. Now, for instance, it is a little bit more advanced technique, but fingerstyle. Fingerstyle in the classical guitar world is a very important kind of fingerstyle. Sometimes it's a bit more of a strum pattern, sometimes you do it with a plectrum, but fingerstyle was one of the, from memory, original kind of starting points with how you learn guitar. Sometimes you had a plectrum, but sometimes you would play things fingerstyle. And playing it fingerstyle is actually a very transferable thing in reference with playing it on the piano. So if I were to play something on the piano, for instance, in some ways, when I just improvised that just now, when I improvised that just now, I was thinking kind of how I would play a guitar in a lot of ways. And, I mean, that's just my kind of interpretation, personal experience, but there's some aspects which I would approach a piano like a guitar with, really. Sometimes it's the use of singular chords and arpeggios, but sometimes it's just simply the way I might structure my approach to playing a piece. Now, in reference with how one can kind of observe between the two, find a little dichotomy, when it comes to the beginning point, it is a little bit tricky at times, as I may have briefly said before. But in reference with how we would kind of play between the instruments and kind of keep the practice on both instruments, it's very careful that we don't overdo it. One, because we burn out too easily, and two, we make sure that alongside that, we just don't injure ourselves. Because it requires two different sets of play. Because when it comes to playing with the piano, whether it's something like C major, for instance, in some ways it's a cyclical pattern, whether it's fast or slow. But in the guitar, it's definitely not as much of an easier point, because you also have to figure out where your strings are, where your fingers are going. In some ways, it is a little bit of a simple point. I take back that one. But in some ways, when it comes to learning the guitar and the piano, there's lots of differences and lots of similarities. And I hope that this video has been able to kind of provide a little bit on that. So just to kind of cap it off, I'll show C major once more, but then I'll describe how it'll be done on guitar. So, in reference with C major on the piano, it's a very linear kind of angle. I'll just move my keyboard, my camera just a little bit so we can face the keyboard. It's a very linear up and down fashion. But with the guitar, think, for those who aren't really guitar players who might happen to be watching this video, think in terms of we're going down, but we're just moving our hand down a little bit. Our fingers just happen to be moving down, almost like we're pulling something down, and we happen to be moving our fingers just along the laneway. That's what we're kind of doing. So in reference with C major, whether we're playing the chord, or otherwise we're doing the scale, it's really important that we consider it as kind of a horizontal way instead of a vertical. It's simultaneously vertical and horizontal way, but with the piano, it's much more of a purely horizontal way, because the piano isn't changing shape upwards; it's changing shape directionally, as in left to right. But with the guitar, it's little bits of left to right, but mainly an up and down sort of process. And the tricky thing is guiding our hands through that process. Anyway, I hope that's a useful tip, and I hope that this lesson has proved beneficial for you. Take care and have a good one.